Julian Barnett from London. Do I need to tell you where I am? Well, I will anyway, but I'm sure you know. I'm in Trafalgar Square, one of the great squares of the world. Right up there along St. Peter's Square, Red Square, and so on. This is one of the greats. And I'm going to do 3 tours in and around this square. The first tour, or I should say, let's work backwards. The third tour is going to be slightly west. I'm going to take you to the streets surrounding the square. The second tour is going to be east. Again, taking you to some of the streets and little hidden places around there, combined with certain aspects of the square itself. But this, the first of 3, is looking at one thing only, that. Nelson's Column in all its glory. 52 metres high, 170 feet, built 1840 to 43, under the supervision of 3 architects, Railton, Barry, and one other person which I'm going to mention a little later, but I'm saving that for when we get to the Lions, because they have a great story. Trafalgar Square is absolutely crucial, and it all revolves around that column, because Nelson's Column commemorates the death of Nelson, one of the great national heroes of this country, and commemorates the Battle of Trafalgar that occurred 21st of October 1805. This was the battle that ended with an English victory and ended with, in effect, the naval superiority of this country for the 100 years that followed. So it is of critical importance to the history of this country, and because this country was so involved with so much was happening in the world in the late 18th and 19th century, in a way what this commemorates is an event that really set the tone, for better and for worse, in the 19th century. Let's have a look at Nelson's Column, and I want to point out a few things. And what I'm trying to do is convey that point that although some of the places I've taken you to in London are quite obscure and are places that you wouldn't normally go to, other places I'm taking you to in London are places that are really familiar. But what I'm intending to do with the familiar places is to invert them and take you to the familiar and show you a completely different side of it. To ram home that point that nothing in London is as it seems, and that London is such a layered and nuanced city, one can go somewhere where one has been maybe 100 times and find lots of new things about it. Let's give an example of that. We're all familiar with Nelson's Column, or maybe we all are if we're living in the UK and we're British citizens, but even around the world, people around the world, billions of people, might not know it as Nelson's Column, might not know anything about Nelson, might not know about the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar, but they will know that that's a London monument. So let me tell you a bit about it. As mentioned, 52 metres, 170 feet. It is the tallest freestanding Corinthian column in the world. And those measurements I've given you go just to the platform on the top of the column. They do not include Nelson himself. I'll come on to that shortly. Now I want you to look closely at that column, because something that is so high you would have thought would have fallen down by now. The reason I say that is because if you look closely at the stonework on the column, you haven't got interlocking bricks, each connecting and holding each one in place. What you have is literally piles of Portland stone piled one on top of the other. So how is that column still standing, is my obvious question. Well, the answer is it's a bit of an illusion. It's a bit of an optical illusion, because what is holding up that column isn't the stonework. What's holding up the column is one massive pole of steel rammed into the ground from the top to well below the bottom, something like 30 metres down. That is really what the column is. The rest of the stonework just dresses that steel rod and keeps it in place. So that's the first thing to say about it. You can also see at the very bottom of the column a huge bronze relief. Can you see it there? People fighting. That is actually the death of Nelson. On each side of the column there is a massive bronze relief to commemorate the 4 great battles of Nelson's career. And I'll say more about Nelson shortly. The Battle of Copenhagen, the Battle of the Nile, the Battle of St. Vincent, and of course most famous of all, after which this square is named, the Battle of Trafalgar. Nelson famously died at the Battle of Trafalgar. One could go on and on and on about Nelson for days. This is a remarkable, controversial, fascinating character. Those famous words that Nelson was said to have uttered just prior to dying on the HMS Victory, his flagship that fought and won the Battle of Trafalgar, was "Kiss me, Hardy." Now, Hardy was Nelson's most senior officer on the boat. Hardy was nursing Nelson as he lay bleeding to death from a sniper's bullet. There were two versions of that. Was he saying "kiss me, Hardy" as affection, as in his last moments of life, as he knew he was facing death imminently? Did he just want, as any human being wants, just the comfort of a fellow to come close to him and hold him as he died? Or was it kismet, Hardy? Kismet. Kismet being an English corruption of an ancient word from the Indian subcontinent to do with reincarnation. Was Nelson really coming up with something deep here? Reincarnation, kismet, Hardy. We will never know, but there are two wonderful versions of what Nelson was. Let me give you one little anecdote, the sort of person Nelson was. He was a national hero. He received a state funeral after his death. Very, very few British non-royal citizens receive state funerals. State funerals are reserved for the monarch or members of the royal family. Winston Churchill, 1965, received a state funeral when he died. Margaret Thatcher did not. It's often said that she did. She didn't. She received an official funeral, which is the second level down from state funeral. But this man, Nelson, received a state funeral. Controversial to the end, because he disobeyed orders to the end. But he was loved by his crew and he was hugely admired. He was a national figure. Let me give you one little anecdote about Nelson. At one of his most famous battles, when he was not yet the most senior admiral in the Navy, he was given an instruction. The instruction was that he must stand down, that he must not allow his ship to get involved in the particular skirmish that the ships around were going to get involved with. Nelson was convinced, no, my commanding officers are wrong, and I'm going to take my ship into action and win. How were things communicated in those days? Well, they're communicated by flags, little flags, hoisted up onto the pole of a ship that would then, each flag, almost like a Morse code of flags, each flag made a letter. So a series of 6 flags would make a 6-letter word, and so on. Nelson had sustained an injury in a previous battle. He'd lost one eye. So when the order goes up from the commanding ship in the Navy to Nelson's ship, about a quarter of a mile away, do not attack, do not engage, Nelson puts his telescope to his blind eye. So he's making the motion of reading the message. And he says to his second in command, "I see no message, sir. I see no message." Isn't it wonderful? He therefore completely avoids and ignores the order from above. He engages and he wins. That was the sort of person Nelson was. Back to the column. You have those 4 huge sculptures at the bottom, made by a bronze sculptor called Mortlake, who made those 4 great commemorations of his battles. And you also see at the bottom of the column 4 huge bronze lions, arguably, maybe with the competitor of the lions in St. Mark's Square, Venice, the most famous bronze lions in the world. But now look at those lions, because although they are wonderful, wonderful figures, they are anatomically incorrect. I said to you that there were 3 architects for Nelson's column: Railton, Barry, and the third was Edwin Landseer. Now, Landseer was a human sculptor. He was not an animal sculptor. When Nelson's column was being built, 1840 to 43, Queen Victoria, pretty young on the throne by then, only on the throne for 6 years, says to Landseer, she hears about him, she's admired his work, and she says, "I want Landseer to sculpt the 4 lions at the bottom of the column." Landseer said, no, I'm not an animal sculptor, I'm only a human sculptor. Well, he kept turning down the Queen's request. How many times can you turn down the Queen's request? By the time we get to her 5th request, he had to oblige, but he made a condition. And the condition was that because he's not used to animal anatomy, because he's not used to sculpting animals, he will only sculpt those lions and make those lions if he can do it from a real lion. Well, as luck would have it, in London Zoo that year, 1842, a lion died. So the carcass of the lion was brought to Landseer's home in Kensington. It was lowered by steam-powered crane into the huge studio window in his studio and lowered into his actual place for him to start to sketch. And for 3 days, from the 28th to the 31st of July 1842, he furiously sketched away every aspect of that lion so he could get it right, and from his sketches then start to sculpt. Well, it was a hot summer, so I think you can guess what the problem was. By the second day of sculpting, that lion was just beginning to reek. So they had to get rid of the lion. So therefore, what was decided? It was decided that he had the top part of the lion, which he had actually drawn. He just had to improvise to get the bottom part, the legs. So what did he do? He happened to have a cat. So he thought, well, it's all part of the same family, it's the felines. So I'm just going to sketch on feline legs on the very beautifully top part of the lion that he'd been sketching for those 3 days, meticulously. So what you therefore have is an anatomical error. Look at those front legs of the lion there, shown wonderfully to scale by this person that's actually sitting there, so you really get an idea of its size. What you have there, you have these legs, these front legs that are simply ridiculously short. They're too short for what should be a lion. The other error of Landseer himself is that when a lion or any feline sits, when it's in repose, you have a concave back, so the back slightly dips. No such thing on this lion, because remember, Landseer was painting and then sculpting a dead carcass. So any movement or any natural pose of that dead lion would have been lost because it was dead. So he also got the back wrong. So it's a lovely little thing. The arguably the most famous lions in the world, sculpted lions, are actually anatomically incorrect. Now look, I want to take you round to the west side of the actual column, because there's a very interesting little feature on the side that was certainly not planned by those that built the column. And that is some quite dramatic bomb damage caused during the Second World War, during the Blitz. Remember, we're in the middle of Westminster, we're in the middle of Trafalgar Square, we are just 400 metres up from the Houses of Parliament. This was, to use a modern term, ground zero for the Luftwaffe as they were bombing. If they'd got a hit of Nelson's column, that would have been fantastic, because this was top of their list. A hit on Nelson's column, a hit on the Houses of Parliament, a hit on St Paul's. That's what you want to do at the heart of a nation to really get that morale to drop. Notice all over the column you have this stone damage caused by the Blitz. In fact, in lots of our tours about London, I'm going to be pointing out Blitz damage. It's everywhere. Sometimes Blitz damage was so serious they would have to knock down the building. Thousands of buildings were not pulled down. If they weren't destroyed during the Blitz, they were pulled down because the damage had been so severe. Others sustained damage that was manageable, but it was patched up. But in certain parts of London, the authorities decided just to leave the damage, because it's a poignant reminder of what happened here not so long ago. So here's a great example. This would have been shrapnel damage. The bomb, I understand it, landed very close by, and it flung all types of shrapnel that hit the side of this, but it was decided just to leave it as it is. So, and you see this all over London. Okay, let's step back a bit now, and I want to say a bit about Nelson himself under the column. So there he is, the great man himself, Lord Horatio Nelson. Do you know that every single night in the Royal Navy, on every single ship, in the officers' mess, there is a toast. Everybody stands at dinner and makes a toast to the Lord Nelson, God bless him. Such is the mythological status that this man has in this country and in the Royal Navy, the premier armed service. Nelson himself stands on a drum that sits on the platform. Let me tell you something about that platform. When the column was finished in 1843, the platform was just flat. Nelson wasn't yet up there. Imagine this situation. The 3 architects that I've mentioned, the 17 engineers, the 42 stonemasons were all hoisted up on pulley systems to the top of the column. On the top of the column there was a huge oak table made from oak from the HMS Victory, Nelson's legendary flagship. And there they had a candlelit supper, 52 metres, 170 feet up at the top. We know what they ate, roast venison. We know what they drank. We know what they had for dessert. And it was an absolutely remarkable thing. Only in Victorian England would you have a situation whereby there was a candlelit supper with white linen on an oak table all that distance up. There were crowds of thousands watching this bizarre spectacle go on as these people stoically had their dinner. But then came the next step, what to put on top. Everybody knew Nelson had to go on top, but the question was, how should Nelson be kitted out? Now remember, Nelson died as a Georgian admiral, 1805. But this column is being built in 1843, well into the Victorian period. So there was a huge debate over how to dress him. Should Nelson be dressed in Georgian admiral's costume, uniform? People felt that that was dowdy, it was out of date. They needed to put him in something else. In a competition that was launched countrywide, one major winner was the idea that we should dress him up in toga and laurel leaves, sort of old imperial Rome, to signify power, prestige, dignity. But what won was a bizarre solution, a Victorian version of what they thought a Georgian naval uniform should look like. And that is what is up there. Although he's too far high up to see, his uniform is actually a complete mishmash makeup. It's, as I say, a Victorian version of what they thought a Georgian admiral should look like. But it works and it's fine. Where is Nelson looking? It's often mistakenly said he's looking down towards Parliament. Well, why would that be the case? He wasn't a parliamentarian. Nelson is actually looking on a direct trajectory to the Bay of Trafalgar, just off the Spanish coast, because that is where he achieved his greatest victory and of course where he met his death. So the angle of his head is straight towards Trafalgar. And here's a fascinating little thing. Nelson looks just right. There he is, standing on top of the column. He's holding a sword, he's standing proud. You can see that he has his arm, or he lost his sleeve without an arm inside his chest. And you can see he's standing in a very dignified fashion. He looks right, everything looks right. But really everything is sort of wrong. If you were standing on one of the high buildings around Nelson's column, just follow my hand here. If you were standing here on the top of Canada House, the Canadian Embassy in Trafalgar Square, much higher up, or follow my arm again, if you're standing on South Africa House, the South African Embassy, or if you were standing within the Tower of St Martin in the Fields, or if you were standing on the roof of the National Gallery, any of those places, Nelson starts to look entirely wrong, because Nelson was designed to be viewed from ground level. And the very clever geometrists and sculptors realised that if we make Nelson completely right as a human being, he'll look all too short, like those fairground mirrors, where you look peculiar when you stand in those wibbly wobbly mirrors. So Nelson was actually sculpted with his legs 2.5 times the length of his body. He was designed to be seen from 170 metres, 52 feet down. So it's quite a brilliant optical illusion, and you only realise it's an illusion when you're in any of those higher buildings. One final thing about the height of the column, by pure coincidence, and to give you an idea of how deep parts of the London Underground network are, the tube, the height of Nelson's column is precisely the depth of the deepest platform in the London Underground network. Any ideas where that is? 3, 2, 1. Hampstead Tube Station, the deepest platform on the London Underground network. Exactly the depth of the height of this column. So there you have it. Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. You've got it all. This is the centre of London. You've even got your red London bus. This is one of the great centres of London. It is the soul of the city. It's where so much history has occurred. And I've just spoken for 20-25 minutes just on one thing in that square, Nelson's column. Future talks, I'm going to take you in the streets around the square. I'm going to tell you about the smallest police station in Britain. I'm going to show you lots more. So thank you for listening, and see you again soon from Nelson's column, Trafalgar Square. Bye-bye.